Archaeogenetics. It's an Archaeodeath interview with Dr. Tom Booth.
Welcome, Archaeodeathlings, to another Archaeodeath interview, and I'm really excited to be having a conversation with Tom. And please, Tom, introduce yourself much better than I could possibly do. Welcome, Tom.
Okay, I'm Dr. Tom Booth. I'm a senior laboratory research scientist at the Francis Crick Institute in the Ancient Genomics Laboratory, led by Pontus Skoglund, that we have there. So I work there on a project that's aiming to sequence at least 1,000 genomes from people who lived in Britain over the last 10,000 years or so. So the main aim of the project is to look at evolution through time, how different genetic variants linked to disease and diet have changed through time in Britain, and what's that related to environment and culture. But also look at the genetic history of Britain through time, how migrations and mixtures between different peoples in Britain have changed the genetics of people who live here, and sort of explain the variation that we see in Britain today. But then within that, because we're doing so many samples, we obviously get these site-specific interesting patterns of close relatives that we can look at to look at things like how kinship is influencing, or perceived kinship is influencing, the way that people are buried at certain sites, and particularly in prehistory before written records, where it's quite unclear as to there's no sort of direct written record as to what people believe and what kind of funerary treatment they're engaged in. So there's sort of these broad level aims that are very biological, medical focused, but then within that, the kind of more stuff that I tend to be more interested in are these sorts of social, humanities based questions about relatedness, migration, mixture and things.
It's exactly, and this is the exciting thing of this. I don't know how you feel, so please, if you wince, I would understand the DNA revolution, but this decade plus transformation of the way we're looking at burial archaeology, but also archaeology more broadly in prehistory and into the historic periods. And it's that micro and the macro that and that's so exciting you introduced it that way, because I think that is one of the key aspects that I think is so, but also bewildering for those that are like me, struggling to keep up and struggling to navigate. Every year students are reading different things, responding to different things. I'm trying to keep up on period specific, but also broader. And it is a minefield also, as we talk about that and this is a preface for anyone watching, that Tom and I have to be very sensitive about how we say things, because we know that literally every half phrase is picked up and quoted by some pseudoscientist or some fantasy channelers as somebody said and as a voice of authority. The Yanomami did this, or whatever they call, not the Yanomami, the Yamnaya, or the I get my Y's mixed up, or although it could be pseudo archaeology, it could be any of these, or the early medieval peoples do X, or Vikings do that, and it's we've got to be very couch ourselves very carefully. So I just want to say we will be delving into that, but equally Tom and I have got to be very cautious about how we on YouTube sort of deal with these issues. But I would love to start off, Tom, by sort of getting a sense for the benefit, particularly of students and other scholars, of how you became you. How did you get into this specialist field?
So I did an undergraduate degree in Archaeological Science at Sheffield University, the Archaeology department there, which is obviously now sadly defunct. It was the last year that they had
painful,
as an official archaeology department, which is an act of vandalism as far as I think most people in archaeology are concerned, in terms of how well regarded that department is and how many people who have gone on to great things have come out of that department. But beyond that, I did a master's there in Human Osteology and Funerary Archaeology, and then I also did my PhD there, which in I say it's in bioarchaeology. What I was looking at was when we look at archaeological bones, the inside of archaeological bones microscopically, so the internal bone microstructure, we can see that in many cases the internal microstructure has been completely destroyed by tunneling bacteria or microorganisms. Fungus might be involved as well as cyanobacteria in aquatic environments, but it's primarily this bacterial tunneling. And what I was looking at is how the bacterial tunneling varies in different human remains, and what explains that variation. And off the back of that project, there'd been, as you mentioned, this what some people call a revolution in ancient DNA technology, and there was a lot of new basically ancient DNA had suddenly, all of the things that people imagined ancient DNA would do in the sort of 90s, 2000s, but sort of didn't really live up to expectations. This new change in technology meant that DNA could now live up to those expectations and do the things that everyone expected to be able to do with DNA. So you had a lot of projects and a lot of laboratories getting off the ground around that time and starting new projects. And there was a new project at run between the Natural History Museum in London and University College London, and they were advertising for a postdoc to basically collect human remains to sample for ancient DNA. And the reason why I got selected to be the postdoc on that project was because I'd done all this work looking at the way that bones have been degraded by bacteria, and that's one of the factors that can influence DNA survival in bones. The idea is I would come in and be able to pick the bones that would have the best DNA preservation, because at the time, I just started getting into the technical aspects of ancient DNA. What people were finding was that this new DNA technology, what it allows you to do for the first time is essentially sequence a rich representative sample of all the DNA which is in a sample. But what most researchers were finding at the beginning when they were sampling archaeological bones is the vast majority of the DNA, maybe 99% of it, was coming from microorganisms or environmental DNA, and maybe 1 or 2% would be from the ancient human. So the idea was that if I could find bones or predict which bones were likely to be well preserved that wouldn't have had this bacterial tunneling, you could find bones that had good DNA preservation. A couple of months after I started, there was a big, sort of quite a consequential discovery by the DNA lab in Dublin that these particular skeletal element, the petrous portion of the temporal bone. So the temporal bone is the bone on the side of your head that surrounds your ear, and the petrous portion is this very dense bit of bone that surrounds your ear canal moving inside your ear. And that bone actually preserves DNA incredibly well, not all the time, but a lot more of the time than any other bone in the human body. And so when you sample that bone, you have 50, 60, 70, sometimes 80 to 90% of the sequences that you're getting back are from the human and not these environmental sequences. So actually, when couple of months after I started, the kind of knowledge about preservation became a lot more redundant than it was at the beginning. But it meant that sort of through that project, I was very much on the ground floor of the ancient DNA revolution, if people want to call it that, and meant that I thought through my master's degree that I'd learned things about ancient DNA, and I had, but it wasn't really the kind of things that it didn't really cover this new, because I mean this had only been at the time maybe 3 or 4 years in the making, and it wasn't, people outside of ancient DNA and these very biomolecular oriented disciplines, it hadn't really twigged what was happening, that there'd been this big step change in the technology. So when I got there, I really knew nothing, but through working with particularly Ian Barnes and Selena Brace at the museum, who were really good at communicating quite complicated things to people like me who don't have a specialism in molecular biology. Through that, I picked up all the sort of an understanding of what this new technology does, what the new analyses do, and what the computational analysis that have been developed to look at all this data do. So through that postdoc, I sort of got a training in new ancient DNA as well, but from a perspective of someone coming in from with an archaeological background. And then I also did at the same time this other, a slightly different postdoc with the University of Bristol with Joe Brook there, which was sort of continuing my PhD work, which was looking at using this bacterial attack to look at funerary treatment. But here we were radiocarbon dating bits of bone to see whether people were keeping hold of bits of bone and potentially curating bits of bone and looking after it before it was being deposited. And the main aim of that was to test bits of human bone and something else that we could date from the same context to see if there was a big gap between the date of the human bone and the date of the thing that it was buried with. Because what people maybe sometimes forget is that the radiocarbon date doesn't date the point at which something was put in the ground, it dates the point at which that organic thing died. So for humans, it's the date of death. So if someone died a long time before their bone was initially deposited, you might see a big gap in their the sort of date of death and date of deposition of the remains. So basically, I was going around looking at prehistoric, usually Bronze Age sites from Britain, fetching the human bone, finding something from the same context that's datable, and seeing whether in certain instances, the human bone was these single pieces of human bone were a lot earlier than the thing that was dating the deposition, suggesting that the person had died and the bone was kept and used and circulated a long time before it was deposited. And then I was doing that project at the same time as the Ancient DNA project, complicated reasons why. And then I went on to work a little bit for this Comios project that was run by Ian Armitt in York and David Reich in Harvard University, looking at DNA in the Iron Age Britain. And then this project at the Crick got started in 2019 by Pontus, and was starting his lab up. So I joined his lab and been working there ever since. Sorry, it's a convoluted way to get there. But...
No, it's really important for those, and so matter of factly and humbly put, I feel compelled to point out to viewers and listeners who may not be familiar that even if we take out your contribution to the ongoing genetic research, those pre-genetic projects are, we'll put the links in the descriptions, but are, if in themselves, treated here as footnotes in your biography, but are really important contributions to understanding prehistoric long preservation of human remains and the depositional practices of human remains, curation of human remains, really important projects. So we don't have to go on about them. They're an interview in themselves, and we'll put links in the description, but they are really prominent projects that have made real insights I use with my students and read and just a yay for those in themselves, and so much so that I keep forgetting you're the same Tom Booth who's been on all these different things. But no, I mean, seriously, it's important to recognize that for audiences who may not be familiar. So if you want to check out that research, that's really cool. So since 2019, what's happened with your ongoing work? Because it's one of those it's like a project within projects, aren't there? There's many different elements to it, and I can't keep up with it all. So I'm sure you struggle to juggle it all. But give us some of the sense of the highlights of the unfolding publications that have shed light on the genetic history as you've been pursuing it.
So yeah, from the Pontus's lab that I've been working on, or we've been working on the past few years, I mean, mainly it's been accumulating these big samples. I mean, we started off with the aim of getting 1,000 genomes, but what's happened is that every few years a new sequencing platform comes along, which essentially makes the sequencing cheaper. And so, the Crick, because the Crick is well funded by a medical institute, every time a new platform comes along, it buys a new one. So the sequencing costs keep on dropping. So actually, the longer time has gone on, the more genomes we can do. So actually, we're probably going to end up with many more than 1,000 genomes to look at in the end. So mainly it's been accumulating samples from those. We've had a few different papers that have come out on sort of varied topics. So one led by my colleague Kakia was looking at chromosomal aneuploidy. Well, chromosomal aneuploidy. So this is when people have different combinations of chromosomes than what is typical amongst the population. So that includes things like Down syndrome, which is we have an extra copy of the chromosome 21. And so previous to us, there had been other groups that had found ancient individuals who had Down syndrome. Most prominently, there was an infant from a Neolithic tomb in Ireland who had Down syndrome that was again found by Dan Bradley's group in Dublin. But what Kakia developed was this method of finding all different kinds of aneuploidies systematically. So one of the aneuploidies that are one of the obvious ones that you can find is sex chromosome aneuploidies, where people have an extra Y chromosome. So a sort of genetic male individual has an extra Y chromosome, or you can have people with 2 X chromosomes and a Y chromosome, or you can have Turner syndrome, which is people, a genetic female, but only having 1 X chromosome. So it allows us to identify these sort of sex chromosome aneuploidies, which it's difficult to say because sometimes these sex chromosome aneuploidies, people don't know that they have them. It has no effect on their bodies at all. But in other cases, they may have had effects on people's bodies, which, based on how they were buried, might have changed how their sort of gender identity was interpreted by the people around them. I mean, there were a couple of examples of potentially that happening, where maybe people with a sex aneuploidy were buried with sort of grave goods that would have usually been gendered as male and female. And I mean, it's speculative to talk about, but I think it's worth exploring whether the sort of biological changes sometimes enacted on the body by those sex chromosome aneuploidies affect them in a way which sort of fed into understandings of that person's gender amongst the community, or even their biological sex. So it allows us to get another dimension in which to explore those sorts of questions. I mean, in a lot of cases, it wouldn't have had any effect at all. People wouldn't have even known that they were carried it. But in other cases, when the changes would have been more acute, it's possible to. It's worthwhile to think about the possibility. Another one we've looked at. So as well as human DNA. And I talked about that you also get a lot of DNA from the environment, but what also sometimes survives in ancient archaeological human remains are, and animals, to be fair, DNA from pathogens that were infecting them when they died. And so one of the ones that's actually picked up quite a lot is the bacteria Yersinia pestis,
Yes.
which was responsible for the Black Death and probably, well, it was almost certainly also the Justinianic plague of the sort of 5th, 6th centuries AD. And so what that allows us to do in the first instance, on an individual level, we can sort of add to someone's what we call an osteobiography now, in that if they were infected with a disease like that, we can say they probably, can't say for absolute sure, but they probably died of it. We can't really say that they were definitely infected with it when they died, but if it's a particularly severe disease, then they probably did die of it. But also it allows us to look at the evolution of diseases through time by comparing them and putting them in phylogenetic trees and seeing where certain strains of disease died out and potentially where they originated from, if we compare diseases from all over the world and see what sort of strains they belong to and which kind of clades. But what this has also allowed us to do, our paper led my colleague Pooja Swali, found plague in a 4,000-year-old to 2000 BC funerary monument in Cumbria. So this is essentially our work, and other work by other labs has identified that there was an earlier outbreaks of Yersinia pestis back in the sort of what's classified as the late Neolithic Bronze Age, between about 3,400 and 2000 BC. All across Europe, you get these little outbreaks of Yersinia pestis and plague, and it seems like it spread all the way to Britain. So these one person, we found Pooja found two people, one in Cumbria and one in Somerset, that date to about 2000 BC, that had probably died of, or at least were infected with plague when they died.
Wow.
And so that's giving us a much better idea of the dynamics of disease and what it's related to and how it changes with environment and culture through time, as well as sort of the genetic responses to those diseases that we see in the human DNA as well.
So this was, just to reiterate that, and just to double check, this is literally, we had no idea of the prehistory, sorry, not my own microphone, the prehistory of these diseases. Obviously, there'd been debates about the Justinianic plague and whether it was the same as the later outbreaks, and that, I believe, is now confirmed. And now you've got it going back millennia. I mean, that just, the implications of that are quite, can't even get my head around that, but it does show that, that these outbreaks are, as endemic, I don't know if that's the right term, but certainly are associated with humans since farming, at least, in that population explosion and the transmission, trade, exchange, contacts, it speaks to all those issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the thing about prehistory, what we say about prehistory, is that it's always weirder than you can imagine, and maybe that we can ever imagine. And the thing about these past diseases is that they're not, even though they're the same species, they're not necessarily the same disease. So the thing that's been, and it may not have even had the same sort of symptoms that you see later on. So there's a big debate in sort of archaeology of Bronze Age Europe about how severe these outbreaks of plague were and how deadly they were and how virulent it was. Because the key thing that through looking at the DNA from the old plague and comparing it to sort of Black Death and the kind of bubonic plague, Yersinia pestis, that you get today, you can see that it's missing a key gene which allows it to be transmitted by fleas in the Bronze Age. So naively, assuming that there's not some bits of the genome that essentially we can't capture because they are novel and don't exist in the sort of modern day genomes, that you would interpret that as being that it could only be spread sort of by droplets, person to person, pneumonically,
Right.
or if
Yeah.
an animal with the plague bit you, so septicemic plague. But I mean, at least with the modern day plague, the droplet spread is quite rare. So this has led to discussions about whether it was so virulent, because if it wasn't being spread by the fleas, it might not have spread quite as easily. But
Yeah.
at the same time,
Okay.
at the same time, we get people with plague in sort of 3rd millennium BC Europe, well, across not just Europe, but across Asia as well. So we have this thing where we're not quite sure how virulent it is, but yet it is quite widespread at the same time. But increasing work that's being done suggests that it doesn't tend to be, it's not like the Black Death, where because it spreads so quickly and so far, every Black Death genome that you get is exactly the same strain, because it doesn't have time to evolve into anything new. They all look very similar to one another. But these Bronze Age ones, they all look sort of slightly different from each other, suggesting that what you're getting is, rather than a big pandemic, is sort of successive reinfection of different communities at different times, and they'll get infected and then it will die out and then a new strain will come in and get infected. So again, this means that the dynamics of disease in these periods, well, of Yersinia pestis, is a lot different, probably going to be a lot different to what you see later on. I mean, also because of things like population densities are a lot lower, and and the nature of mobility will be different as well, but also the nature of the disease is different as well. So we talk about these diseases, but actually they are different types of disease to what we see in terms of the manifestation to what we see later on. Even though we talk about Yersinia pestis, it's not necessarily the same kind of Yersinia pestis that you see later. And similarly, you can see the same thing with you can see the same thing with the Justinianic plague, that probably wouldn't be, I mean, it's very similar to the Black Death in lots of ways because it's closer in time, but you might speculate that the symptoms and the way it manifested might have been different, which slightly upends attempts, I think, to try and diagnose ancient diseases from symptoms. And a lot of the arguments that go on sort of perhaps is underestimating that the diseases that we see today, or the kind of pathogens that cause disease today, might be slightly different in the past and so had different symptoms. So trying to diagnose diseases in history based upon the described symptoms that you see described in the histories, which were already, arguably of questionable reliability, sort of even less reliable in some ways, because you don't know whether the disease necessarily manifests the same way in the past as it does in the present. So that's an interesting point of discussion as well.
But these are all opening up new vistas of research. That's the key, isn't it? And while hopefully we'll come back to the issue of the snowballing effect of the headline and people are inferring, in Neolithic Europe, a literal similar comparable situation to the Black Death, or and likewise with sex and gender, a very complex and controversial area. For some people, they're going to snowball that into literally a very different scenarios depending on their ideology and attitude. But equally, it's the exciting time that we're being able to ask these questions that I think is the takeaway for me, even though there's so much potential for still ongoing work and qualifying what we mean and so on.
I mean, that's what the exciting thing for me in genetics, in working in archaeogenetics at the moment, is that I mentioned that it's sort of living up to its promise in people, archaeologists sort of in the 2000s and 90s, when ancient DNA was touted as a possibility, although at that time the methods weren't good enough to fulfill it. They were thinking, it means we know people's ancestry, how people were related to each other. But what the new technology and techniques are doing now is that they're actually exploring questions that we didn't even anticipate that they'd be able to necessarily answer. So things like these disease. The other thing that's becoming increasingly more common now, that has the potential to provide some really interesting insights, is not just close relatedness, but you can start to detect very distant relatives. So you have these suite of techniques that's been used where you can identify relatives up to third degree, so equivalent of first cousins. But increasingly now you have these techniques, I won't go into the technical details, but that allows you to see connections that go back 6th, 7th, 8th degree relatives and of two people. So what that's doing when you look at that amongst different groups of people, obviously that you're not really seeing a connection which is like linked to ideas of social kin so much. That's more about you're seeing reproductive networks and reproductive connections between different groups through time. So so you can see these connections which may or may not sort of correspond to material culture, ritual practices and things, between who was having children with who. So you can see these networks of reproductive exchange, which again, which potentially we didn't really anticipate we could have done necessarily in the past in such a direct way.
And so you're getting results on localized kinship, but also this helps to speak to broader migratory patterns or connections, at least how we frame things again in popular culture, diaspora, migration. I lose track depending on which academic particular silo you're in about these terms. It gets to be a minefield, but you are able to look at people moving around, intermarrying or whatever the term, reproducing, and those connections. Every term I use, I end up having to do scare quotes for. I'm turning into a mobile scare quote, for everything.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's some archaeologists that I talk to that say, I mean, just stop with the euphemisms and just say having sex with, because that's what it's basically about. And I mean, this is a problem we talk about marriage, is that, I mean, people default to using marriage, but it's not marriage we're talking about here. It is sex specifically.
No, exactly.
And not just sex, but sex that produces children. So sort of a limited range of sex within that as well. So yeah, there's some arguments that say we should stop being so prudish about it and just say what we actually mean, rather than talking about all these euphemisms.
All these things need a new nest of acronyms. Viable sex that does this, this, and this, and then you sort of create an acronym, and then everyone goes, "What are they talking about?" But seriously, I'm being silly. But equally, it is important to be qualifying these things rather than using all the euphemisms. Yeah,
that's why I said to talk about having children, because I mean, particularly going back to prehistory, that we don't know what if marriage would have meant anything in the in the way that we understand it today. So having children is probably the baseline, kind of the simplest way we could explain it without sort of adding too many layers of ideological baggage on top of it, I suppose.
Yes, exactly.
Presentism.
So obviously, I'm aware of your work on the Neolithic in that regard and population movement. Would you perhaps speak to that and those kind of results?
Yeah. So this was previous work that I've been involved with that other labs have been doing. So looking at in Britain specifically is mainly where I've been based, in looking at these periods of big changes in culture, big changes in economy and subsistence, like for instance the Neolithic. So the Neolithic in Britain begins around 4000 BC, and there's quite, I mean, there's some continuity, but there's also quite significant indications of change. You get the first big stone tombs being built. You get these big flint mines being dug, like Grimes Graves and Sisbury. You get the first domesticated plants, first domesticated animals, or at least you might have sort of earlier hints of that, but this is when it seems to start in real force, where there's a clear horizon in the archaeological record. The first pottery, these ground stone axes. So there's sort of a big shift. And when we look at the genetics of people living in Britain at that sort of pre and before 4000 BC and after 4000 BC, there's a big change in genetics as well that can only really be explained by migrations of people coming in and migrating, communities of people migrating into Britain and settling, and sort of probably largely introducing these farming practices and these new cultures to Britain from continental Europe. And it gets really complicated, and I mean, this is where some of the misunderstandings come in, because these movements kind of have an origin 2000 years earlier in the Near East, in probably what's now Turkey, where farming began, and presumably because of the way that it allows you to maintain larger population sizes, people sort of disperse out of what's now Turkey, Anatolia, into Europe, but very gradually, in a sense that it takes 2,000 years for them to get from Turkey all the way across to Britain. And
it's not like a flood of people like some
No.
Hollywood movie going, we must go to the promised land. Where shall we go? Well, there's somewhere on the west coast of Ireland that we know about because, it doesn't work that way. Yeah, of course. Sorry interrupting.
No, it's good. It's good because that's exactly it. I mean, and I think this is one of the struggles, is how to talk about these movements and genetic change, and the fact that we see movements of groups of people and genetic change which occurs from that. What's the right terminology to use to describe these things, rather than this? I mean, there's this umbrella term of migration, but then migration can refer to lots of different processes, and some people have narrower definitions of what migration means. Some people have broader definitions, and you also have you could use words like I just did, like dispersals, but then some people would argue that, or expansions, but some people would argue that that's again getting back to euphemisms, because essentially you can't have these things happening without people moving, and particularly some of the large-scale genetic changes that we see across Europe at this time, it has to have been groups of people that moved, even if they weren't moving very far, or they were moving very gradually each time, or if it's not a constant movement, it's a movement and then staying where they are for a couple of centuries, and then one group will bud off. So it's a complicated process. And then there's later migrations. We'll talk about migration and genetic change with the same terminology for like the Neolithic that we would for, say, like the early medieval period, and migrations that happen then, when they're completely different processes involving different types of dynamics, different motivations. But I think the problem is sometimes is that we in ancient DNA we talk about them in the same way, and then when that's taken by the public and journalists and things, they're assumed to mean the exact same thing in terms of the whole kit and caboodle, the baggage, the motivation. So every migration and genetic change that happens in British history is sometimes taken to mean an invasion in the mold of something like what traditionally how the Anglo-Saxon migrations are understood, when each of these processes is very different from one another and happening in very different contexts. So for the Neolithic in Britain, it seems clear that basically after people move in, the genetic signature of the people that were there before them, the people who were in Britain in the Mesolithic, almost totally disappears, but not immediately, and not in a way that necessarily implies that sort of one group was wiped out by another. So the problem always with these ancient DNA techniques is that things are changing slightly on this regard, but you can only get ancient DNA if there's human remains there. And the problem with a lot of these periods where you get migration is the period immediately before people are doing things with their dead that leave no archaeological record.
Yes,
so
exactly.
If they continue doing that after migrants arrive, then we'll disproportionately see the genetic impact of the migrants and not see sort of continuity of the local people. And I think there's evidence that's definitely happening in at least 2 points in British prehistory when you get migration. So, for instance, in Western Scotland, although you get this big change in the genetic signatures of people in Britain, in Western Scotland you see odd individuals that have quite a lot of ancestry from the preceding Mesolithic population, and they persist for quite a while, for sort of 500 years, between 4000 BC and 3500 BC. And what that suggests is that you have to have pockets of people who are descended from the previous population who are sort of persisting in these areas in parallel with these new groups, and that they're sort of gradually mixing together. But because, and I mean for the Neolithic particularly, because you have these big differences in subsistence, which allows the people who are farming to maintain much higher population sizes, you can see how over hundreds of years that farming signature, if they're living these parallel with different sort of subsistence strategies and different economies and different ancestors, you can see over hundreds of years that the genetic signature of the farmer will become the predominant over the genetic signature of those Mesolithic hunter-gatherer populations. And that seems to be what vaguely happens across most of Europe, although the regional dynamics are different, change in different places. That's broadly what seems to happen.
Right.
So why we can say that migrants, migrations of groups of people were a big driving force in the development of the Neolithic of Britain. There's still something happening with the local population that continuing from the Mesolithic there. They're persisting and at times sort of joining these communities of farmers to some extent as well, that needs to be unpicked in a more nuanced way, like we said, going from this macro scale to the micro scale and looking at individual sites and what's going on at individual sites to see the differences and what those differences mean, how they could be explained.
And we are sometimes able to get into those individual sites and sort of explore sort of some. We can't be too definitive of the timescales of relationships and exact relationships, can we? Or can we actually be quite confident now that we're getting sort of precise? This is the maternal uncle of this person, and well,
the relatives help in that they help to put an actual generational timescale on things if you have a lot of relatives. In that, and again, this is something that ancient DNA is helping with that maybe we didn't anticipate that it would. The sort of genetic relatives, and particularly the distant ones, are helping with chronologies. So you have there's a famous example of the Hazleton North chambered tomb, which is this tomb in Gloucestershire. This type of monument that's common, maybe not common, but it's being built in Britain at the beginning of the Neolithic, and people were being placed in these tombs over significant lengths of time. And it seems like those people are getting put in, so the remains get more and more mixed up. And there was a big study where the lab, it was the Harvard lab, they essentially just carried on sequencing bones from the tomb until they were only getting back individuals that they'd already found. So they tried to get in human osteology, you have this minimum number of individuals value, which is when you look at the bones, what's the minimum number of people here represented by the bones. So you have sort of 7 femurs, you know that there must be at least 7 individuals there. But they did that, but with the genetics. And when they got to that stage, they looked at how everyone was related to each other. So they think that they got most of the people whose remains had survived in the tomb. And when they looked at that, most people were genetically in some way related to everybody else. And it was basically I can't remember, six generations of a genealogy. There were some people who weren't in that genealogy, who were totally unrelated. So there was clearly some people in there who were considered kin and were put in the tomb, but weren't had a form of kinship that didn't have a genetic understanding. But a lot of people were, and you could see that. Chris Fowler and Vicky Cummings have written a really good article about this. You can not only see sort of the relationships and the different generations, so you could see things like that everybody that was in there was in some way descended from this one male who was kind of at the top of the genealogy. But then that male had children with 4 different women, and where people were put in the tomb was dependent on their descent from these 4 different women. So there was a maternal organization as well. But then these women had also had children with other men, and the male children from those relationships were also in the tomb, so it looked like they'd probably been adopted into that patriline as well. So they were kind of adopted sons of the descendants of this man. But then also you can see that it goes into more detail in the paper that there were each generation there are slight tweaks into who is ending up in the tomb and why. So you can see that you can actually see for the first time these generational decisions that are made each time they've been made by different decisions, but as each generation sort of makes something slightly different of the monument than the previous generation decides to change it or revert back. And I mean, getting back to that is essentially history. That is history, but in prehistory, there's history without prehistory. I mean, radiocarbon dating and new ways of looking at radiocarbon dating has already helped us get to these generational timescales, but then ancient DNA is adding a new twist on this and being able to see things in prehistory that are happening over generations. So again, these actual histories of places rather than these broad prehistories, you get these individual histories. And that's interesting when you bring in things like the ancestry, because I mean, at that tomb, what was interesting was that the ancestry of everybody in that tomb was entirely derived from farmers in continental Europe. There was no input as far as they could detect local groups, which basically is direct evidence that communities had to have been moving in to those places because they were only having children amongst themselves. So that must mean men and women and children were all moving into Britain at this time. So it wasn't sort of a sort of just males moving. It wasn't sort of an invasion in that sense of things, or armies. It was movements of communities into these areas. So again, this, as well as giving us this sort of histories of these sites and places, it's also the thing about these micro stories is that it informs on the macro stories, in that you start to see the mechanisms that are actually producing the broad scale genetic changes. So both things are important and complement one another.
So for you to react to, not necessarily to confirm, but one way perhaps of seeing this is that at one level we're getting fine-grained confirmation of what we already suspected, and discounting of long abandoned but still in popular culture prevalent misunderstandings. But in other levels we are getting surprises, we are getting some shifts. That idea that was reckoned by archaeologists no longer is really the primary interpretation. We do have because some people would have said about those Neolithic tombs, it's multi-generations, adapting ideas, a lot of the things you're saying, it's not single, but then a lot of people would have perhaps made the claim, it's just a mixture of people, loads of Mesolithic people just banging around. And you are seeing, I'm sorry, this is a group who can, at least in that specific instance, and we need more cases, it is primarily of continental ancestry. It doesn't mean they were all just like some kind of enclave, not talking or interacting with anyone else, because it's biological doesn't equal the social. But it is challenging perhaps some of the more some of the takes we've seen in Neolithic archaeology. So I don't know if that's an unfair or fair synopsis.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, and again, perhaps this is why, in some ways. But why I think some people sometimes reluctant to talk about this in terms of revolution. It's certainly a revolution in technology, and just the information that we can get now that we couldn't get before, and the richness of that. There's potentially been less of a revolution in our understanding of the past in some ways, in that it has definitely so far, answered some very simple questions one way or the other. Was there substantial migration to Britain accompanying the Neolithic? Yes, there was. Was there substantial migration which accompanied the development of beaker cultures in Britain? Yes, there was. But then every other question that spins off from that is much more contested and requires much more integration of the DNA with the archaeological evidence, and that process is still ongoing. So in that way, it is revolution. The potential is revolutionary, but we're only just starting to kind of meet that potential now, because we've answered. It's these big simple questions that they've answered one way or another, but then beyond those questions, it's a much more complex thing to untangle, and requires years of work, and again, more integration of the genetics and the archaeology. Because I mean, those big questions you can answer quite simply with the genetics to some extent. But then any of the questions that derive from that has to have more archaeology about mechanisms and motivations. And like I said, the micro detail of what's happening and what's driving these things. It has to involve all these things together, and sort of the evidence being much more on a parity, treated with parity with each other. So, and we're in that phase now, and that's going to be kind of the hard slab. But it's exciting because there's so much data about now. You could just put your mind to anything and have all of this richness to bring to the archaeology that's there, and it's all kind of hanging around in the ether of the DNA servers that store that publicly store the DNA sequences that the labs generate.
This is fascinating times. And before we go on to the next stage of the discussion, I just want to remind viewers and listeners that there's so many, not only popular articles and news headlines about this topic, but we'll put all the links to the key publications we're discussing in the comments section, most of which are open access and readily, at least in popular summaries, are readily accessible and understandable. Excuse me. And that leads me to that very point. With power comes great responsibility, as Spider-Man said. With this flood of information, there's a lot of excitement outside of the academy, outside of the scientific community, and you're one of the key voices who've not only been doing the work but also writing about, and I'm very grateful of your contribution to a disease collection I put together a while back, but other papers too in prominent locations. We've been trying to talk about the public consumption of these fields, and a lot of the things you've said have already spoken to that, the need for qualification and careful framing. And I'd just love to get your current sense, because I bet your mood, like mine, goes up and down in optimism and senses of dismay every time you see another headline spin-off of anything. But I just love to get a sense of where you now currently sit about how do scientists and archaeologists navigate the responsibilities of sharing info versus the huge threat of it being immediately consumed by another far-right YouTuber or another news outlet in the other end of the world who will create a take on a headline that no one else will read beyond. And I'd love to hear your sense of that blessing and that curse of an exciting field.
Yeah, well, as in the academic sphere, there's limitations. I think there are, and I've argued this before, there are sort of limitations to what we can do. Like what we can do is, and maybe this was something that in the early DNA papers wasn't done so well, is put qualifications about what the results do and don't mean, and anticipate how things might be misinterpreted, and try to counteract that in the papers. But and you can do so much with that. But in the people, and there are a lot of people who are bad actors that take ancient DNA papers and use them to say particular things, and they will just ignore those statements in the paper. They will write their summary for their audience, ignore the qualifying parts, and then so it's not there. I mean, it's always useful for someone trying to counter that to say, oh well, they also do say this and this and this, to counteract it, and that's what's actually in the paper. But in the end, they have their axe to grind, and they have their audience, and often that hardcore are not going to be convinced. If you point out that things aren't quite how they're putting it, then you just get accused of having an agenda and not understanding, or that the academics who have written it had an agenda. It's like, oh well, they had to put that in because if they didn't, it would have get past the woke peer review or something like that. So
big archaeology, woke archaeology, all these overlapping.
Exactly. So they take what they want, and then they can just leave the rest that they find particularly unpalatable or disagrees with them, and then they can always blow it off. I mean, again, it's always about the worry is to what extent does it permeate through to the mainstream, and with far right groups becoming more prominent across Europe and America, it does get worrying to what extent the work that you're doing, I mean, it unintentionally feeds into the rise of these groups and gives them an idea. And you see a lot of misrepresentation of what ancient DNA is, what it does, what modern ancestry is. I mean, it isn't coincidental, because it's partly to do with technology, that the rise of ancient DNA is tracked by the rise of commercial genetic ancestry testing as well. And I mean, in the public's mind, intuitively, they see those things as sort of complementary and they go together, but they don't fit together so well as people, and because people with particular beliefs in predetermination of and there being a biologically definable people that belong in a particular place in the world, and that people that don't belong, which can be defined biology. They obviously see these two things as incredibly powerful in a way of sort of defining and almost putting an objective spin on what is their sort of ideological basis, when morally and ideologically, as a society, we can't make that connection. So somehow making our society, putting these biological underpinnings under our society is sort of a radical and sort of morally and historically indefensible thing to do. But then beyond that, the way that they use it, they sort of misunderstand or misappropriate aspects of it. So even within their own internal logic, it doesn't really work. There's some arbitrary aspect to what they define as being the true people of this particular place, as opposed to this particular place as well. So I've rambled on a bit, but getting back to the question, it's difficult. I mean, you can do your best in the papers, but it will never stop bad actors from accounting at it. But then it's how to combat that misinformation when it's out there. Yeah. And I think it does just require people literate in both, people who are willing to be public archaeologists who are literate in both genetics and the archaeology, to not necessarily even engage directly with this stuff, but put out more accurate and more compelling interpretations of the same thing, which actually pick up on these aspects that are included in the paper, these qualifiers or these different ways in which the same information can be interpreted, and that there's never one way of just interpreting the DNA information. There could be several different ways, even if the paper sort of concentrates on one particular way. You know, there's lots of wiggle room around that in terms of interpretation. I think that's what it's going to take. I mean, the problem that we're at the moment is that only certain archaeologists are and genetics to some extent are particularly comfortable talking about these issues in public, and then there's not so many of them that feel like they're enough abreast of both things that they could talk about it together and really add the nuance and the complications and to underpin it all.
I mean, one of the fundamental things I'd like to put to you and see what you react to is that at the end of the day, you in your lab, or I don't know, just say me in my academic position, we're not getting paid to do that public archaeology. You know, we try our best with what time we have available. You can't be in every comment section of every weirdy beardy with a YouTube channel or every TikTok video. And likewise, you know, at the end of the day, while my job is paid for to teach students, do some research on the side. A tiny fraction of my time is allocated to that unless I get external funding, and everything else is kind of on the, you know, and the same with so many other passionate voices. We may not agree all the time, but we're putting a lot of effort in from different perspectives, different, you know, ages, genders, backgrounds, to try and combat this stuff. And it shouldn't be about just, and the other thing I think I'd like to, you know, we can feel free to disagree with me, is that we can't, I think you've already said it, it can't be all about combative getting into with those extremists, because they are lost. It's the broader public we've got to try and make sure they've got information. And, you know, just trying to argue with Graham Hancock acolytes or whatever, Cassetti or these other characters, you know, is you're already talking to the lost causes, and they're not the people that you can convince. But I don't know, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because you've got to get this research out there, but you can't always predict how it's going to go.
Exactly. I mean, my mind isn't totally made up about it, because, you know, I think there is some currency sometimes in, if you feel like, and I think this is where we've generally landed, that talking to these people to expose, if you feel like that anybody reasonable person watching the interaction between you will be able to see that you're not doing it to change that person's mind. You're having this conversation to try and convince the people who are watching the conversation.
Exactly.
And in that way, it's kind of almost disingenuous on your part, because it's totally performative. And so you feel a bit bad in sort of being like, well, you know, I'm not having a good faith debate with you because I don't believe you're in good faith. What I'm trying to do is just show people, expose the fact that your logic doesn't add up. And obviously not everyone's going to be convinced by that, but you would hope that the majority of people would be. And that's the idea. And I think I can see the benefit to trying to do that, but then it's also easy to fall down the like rabbit holes of just dogfights where, and I mean it on both, I guess it must be on both sides to some extent. You know, eventually you just get pissed off.
Yes, there's only so much individuals can do, isn't it? It has to
exactly
be,
and then that's where you get into these sort of just dog fights, which probably don't lead anywhere, and it just becomes a game of one-upmanship. So I think engaging, I think it can be done in certain circumstances but you have to set very clear goals to what it is you're trying to do, and that once you start, and beware of mission creep, and once you start sort of getting brought away from those goals, to just stop and disengage. And I mean this problem is that these online communities, the culture is all about confrontation and you know, if and combativeness, and so it's easy to get sucked into this idea that if you don't respond, then you've lost the argument, when that's not you can't sort of reduce yourself to that mindset. Basically, if you feel you've just got to trust in people's reasonableness, or most people's reasonableness, and feel like, okay, I've done enough. I've got to the stage where these discussions are going nowhere. If anyone reasonable person read this, and I think that they would, unless they had something, they would fall. You got to, yeah. There's a certain faith aspect to it, and there's an arbitrary point at which you have to kind of just disengage. But you would hope that would be enough. This would hold true, and sort of reasonably be seen as sort of seeing my side of the argument. But yeah, I think engagement within limits. But yeah, most of the time I think it is because that those people are talking to a particular audience, already preaching to the choir. It is about just putting the counter argument out there. Yeah. But like you said, we don't get paid to do it, and there's a lot of people in academia who wouldn't feel comfortable and don't feel like they have the skills to do it as well. And I don't think we should force people to do it who don't want to do it as well, who don't feel comfortable doing it for whatever reason. But yeah, we're left with a bit of a problem, that there is a gap that is often filled, like with the ancient DNA studies. Obviously, the most, for clear reasons, some of the most passionate and active accounts that talk about ancient DNA research have specifically quite right-wing agendas. Even if it's not necessarily apparent straight away, you can see that it's sort of lurking under the surface. And there are some of the biggest accounts that talk about ancient DNA, and there's sort of a gap where, for all the reasons that we talked about, that we don't get paid to do this, that people are uncomfortable doing it themselves, that we don't have the time to do these things ourselves. That exactly. If you go online and look for ancient DNA research and find an accessible video, then sort of half the time it's from these accounts that are sort of pushing an agenda with it all. So yeah, it's a tricky question how to address that going forward. And
we're discussing it, and that's important, isn't it? And I think
is to try to put more positive versions out there. But yeah, it's people don't really have the time or resources a lot of the time.
No, exactly. And I know, at least in my limited engagement with these issues, I find some of the more things I feel more confident I can address, I don't want to address, because they're either going to upset me so much, they're so close to my area of expertise, I can't. But I'm happy to go, this is a video about Bronze Age burial, it's totally rubbish, and here's why, ABC. And because I know it's kind of it's a bit of a healthy distance from me and the Bronze Age or whatever it is,
right,
and I feel I can do that kind of clap back with a bit more confidence, knowing the articles by, say, you or someone else, where I could refer people to. And it's about, and everyone's got a different sort of comfort zone about what they can tackle with. But yeah, at the end of the day, there is a problem with always looking combative, always looking dismissive. If someone says, well, I'm descended from BJ581, I'm so proud of my warrior woman ancestry, and I just go, no, you're not. Or I can't, I don't do that. I just go or I just ignore, because I thought, I can't, where do you start? Where do you get in? So there's some things that we can't be ubiquitous, we can't do it all. We've got to try our little corner, fight our little thing, but it doesn't always have to be combative. But sometimes we have to go, I do get triggered by certain videos, and I go, no,
right.
But the fact is, we're attentive to this problem, but until we're in a situation where there's the proper funding and support for us to dedicate with every project a PR expert who can do this kind of work, it's always going to be a bit tricky, isn't it? To in the same way as not every project can have, we have these old debates about open access funding built into every project and how that fits in, and then we have all these complex funding games that we've got to try and contend with. But the SciComm, if you, for want of a better word, or the pub outreach, or whatever these overlapping terms, is something that we can't all do all the time if we also want to do the actual research. But I think it's really great we're all trying our best, though, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean the whole, like you said, I'm descended from this ancient skeleton thing. I mean, just picking up that thread, it's probably going to get a whole lot worse, because
yes,
the sort of culmination of the ancient DNA and the fact that ancient DNA sequences are usually made publicly available upon publication, and the commercial genetic ancestry testing, is they're now looking for essentially bits of DNA from ancient individuals in living people, and there's a lot of nervousness about it, because in terms of the genetic testing companies explaining what these things actually mean. And for the person, I mean, if you look at the 23andMe Q&A, was a Q&A on this topic, because they're one of the companies that started doing it, while sort of in their promotional material sort of pushing, oh yeah, we got this great new thing, you compare yourself to ancient individuals, find out if you're connected to a Viking or whatever. But then you go to the Q&A, and then it basically outlines that, oh yeah, these connections are meaningless. But I think maybe everyone's going off I think slightly there's a sense that they're trying to have their cake and eat it, and they want to get people to buy more kits and get excited about doing this, but at the same time they don't want to be accused of misleading people. But they want to try to do both things. I don't think you can do both things. I think a lot of people are going off what's being promoted and not necessarily the detailed Q&A. I mean, these things can be useful. So I mean, part of our project, we're looking at skeletons that are, you know, from the last people who died the last 200, 300 years or so. So post-medieval skeletons. And, you know, so some of the genetic connections that people could find there would be genuinely informative about their genealogy. If you had like a big gap in your family tree, you know, one of those ancient individuals might help fill it by connecting you with living people, because they lived close enough in time for them to be useful in that way, in a genealogical sense. I mean, there's also this possibility, I don't know if I've talked to you about this before, that if people have the right records, genealogical records, and they get connected to an ancient individual, say a skeleton that's been excavated anonymously at an archaeological site, with the right records and with the right triangulation between different genetic relatives that are alive today, you could name that skeleton. You could potentially de-anonymize that skeleton and give its name back, which again raises a whole, like, this goes back to sort of things that we never imagined ancient DNA might be able to do, but goes back to a whole you know, we've been exploring about whether there are any ethical issues with doing this, or with people being able to do this, just so public, because all of this stuff just ends up on these publicly accessible sites that are genealogy sites anyway, or the ancient DNA. So is it, I mean, we can't really, there's nothing sort of disease related or anything that you will be able to infer from an ancient individual's person to a living individual, but it's things like people might find out family secrets that of misattributed paternity that were never meant to be dug up. And it's
I've heard about this happening. Yeah.
Well, I mean,
Australia, I was thinking of people talking to me about it. I don't know the details, but I just.
I mean, both. It's quite telling that in both Richard III and the recent. Was it Mozart? It was Mozart. Yeah, Mozart. No, Beethoven. Yeah, they sequenced DNA from different hair samples from. I think it was Mozart, yeah. And I mean, it's a little bit circular, but I mean, basically decided there were some of them that were different from the others, but there were three that were all the same. They sort of kind of assumed that it's unlikely you're going to get three hair samples that are different if it's not from the original thing. And there was provenancing and things. But I mean, again, those issues aside, when they looked into it, they found that they had to have been, because they had recorded descendants or distant relatives of him, and they sequenced their genetics. They found that there had to have been a false paternity event somewhere in their past, right. Not in the living individual's past. I think it was Mozart or Beethoven. Yeah, I think it was Mozart's past. I talked about this on the radio and I can't even remember.
Oh, it's all right.
But anyway, you get the gist.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
And so the fact that the two main people that this has been done with in both cases. So there was also a case with there seemed to be one of the supposed paternal descendants of Richard III didn't have the same paternal lineage. So basically, somewhere between him and Richard III, there had been a false paternity event. Where someone who they thought that was dead was not their biological father. So I mean, the fact that those two people, the two that have been done, there's 100% success rate for a false paternity so far. Just taking those two individuals. So I mean, people are going to find these things. Yes. But then when it comes to those questions, I mean, I guess, you know, with elite individuals, you could start discussing counterfactuals about, well, what if this and what if that. But I mean, for your average person, you're just essentially slightly pruriently digging into the personal histories and finding secrets that they literally took to their grave with them.
Yeah.
So there's a question about, is that ethical, that we want to,
Yeah.
is it ethical to learn things about these people who are dead that they probably wouldn't want us to know? So that gets into that
The most unhinged
box of frogs. Yeah.
The most unhinged one I will briefly paraphrase, I've heard from TikTok via someone who, in all seriousness, seems just not particularly informed and genuinely interested in their family history, but had got to a point in their videos, and you could watch them. If you, I felt brain cells just falling out of my ears as I watched. But that's a bit patronised. But it's horror. It was just so unhinged. He basically got this idea from like 19th century history that, 18th century, Swedish history, antiquarian, saying that Odin was a historical personage, and and therefore, if we look at the barbarian migrations of the 5th century, we should be able to find Odin somewhere in Hungary. Oh, look, archaeologists have found some graves in Hungary. They've done DNA tests. This is probably Odin's DNA. And my brain is just going, I'm watching these videos. I just did a general commentary. I said, look, we've got to be very careful about these claims, particularly when it involves literally mythological beings.
Yeah, right.
But also, and it was so many layers. I still haven't quite processed it. I've decided I need to have a part of my brain that blocks off all this, because it's just too wacko. But equally, it's done with a sincere motive. I want to find my history. I'm a part of a European colonial project. I'm in America. I'm sort of 7th, 8th generation to 9th, 10th generation from back. I want to know where I'm from, and it's gone down this rabbit hole. And if for that individual, it's mostly harmless, but that is a discourse that can really, whether that individual or not, it really goes into really pernicious places. And so it's difficult to know how to, when I came across that, I said, I'm not going to dump on this individual. There's no point in saying anything about them personally. It's quite tragic. There's so many layers here. I need to sit down with them, have over a coffee for about 7 hours. And
exactly. I mean, it's the time that it takes to explain everything and as to why it's wrong. And I mean, there'll be countless historical arguments, about Odin being a mythological figure and sort of all the support that he was mythological and not really a real person that you could bring in. But there's also like all the genetics but getting down to the basics of why genetically this wouldn't be a very likely thing to happen as well is difficult. I mean, I guess this goes back to the, beyond those genealogically useful individuals, when you get past a certain point, the fact that you share genetic sequence with someone, say, passed around 300 years ago is trivial, really. I mean, because, and I mean, this gets to, again, one of the big public misperceptions about sort of genetics and ancestry and the past is that I think people have this idea that their genetic ancestry is just a bundle of all of their ancestors that kind of ever existed going back, and they don't think too hard at it, when actually the further you only have to go back to like 10 generations, and then people who are your genealogical ancestors start to drop out of your genetics, because essentially, whilst your genetic sequence is an incredibly rich source of information, there's only finite places in it for ancestors. So you get past, say, 10 generations or so on, ancestors who are your genealogical ancestors are not your genetic ancestors. So as you're going back in time, your genetic ancestry becomes a smaller and smaller proportion of your genealogical ancestry. So your genealogical ancestry is also expanding over the time, all over the world as well. So, I mean, you've come across this before, the famous calculation that when you get back to the 10th, if you have any genetic ancestry from Europe, basically everybody who was alive in anywhere in any part of Europe in the 9th century AD and success in the 10th century, and who passed on ancestors, is your genealogical ancestor. I mean, you inherit a DNA from a tiny proportion of them, and that proportion will be mainly from the place where you are from or the population that you're descended from. But your ancestors, your genealogical ancestor, is everywhere. So when you share a bit of DNA with an ancient individual sort of past a few hundred years, it's not very specific in that ancient individual. Firstly, that lots of other living people will probably also share that genetic sequence with them as well, but also that there'll be lots of people who don't share a genetic sequence who are also the descendants of that person, but they just don't share any DNA, and it's just completely I mean, it's to some extent it's geography and happenstance, but it's just chance that you happen to have inherited this DNA from this ancient individual. I mean, I think it's a cool thing, and it's cool to be able to see an ancient skeleton and sort of say, oh, I share a little bit of DNA with this skeleton.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean anything. It's the fact that you do is just chance. It's not predestination. It doesn't give you a particularly sort of I don't think of the good word, enhanced relationship or sort of with that individual or connection to them. Your connection is really no greater than anybody else's. It's just a cool twist of luck that you happen to share DNA with them. But I mean, that's the tension that's within the genetic testing companies doing this, is that they know that people want to be able to do this and have an emotional connection and make this into something significant, but at the same time they know that it's quite insignificant. But yeah, seeing how they balance that in the coming years is going to be interesting. And I mean, the difficulty is that there's increasingly becoming a knock-on effect for people who work in museums, because you're having people contact museums wanting to access the remains of what they see as their ancient ancestor, like some guy who died in Britain sort of 1,000 years ago. And so it raises all these questions of, well, firstly, you know, people in the museum don't have the expertise to be able to explain why it's not quite as straightforward as that. But also, I mean, you can't just start letting people access collections willy-nilly. And like I said, it doesn't give people enhanced access to individual skeletons in that way. I mean, putting sort of repatriation requests for formerly colonized places to one side, because it's a completely different situation. That's about communities rather than individuals, as well as being a totally different historical context. But
yes, of course,
managing that is going to be difficult for museums, because like I said, they don't really have the expertise to assess what this all means, but also, you know, they're already overworked and underpaid and having to deal with this extra burden of people wanting to come in and look at these skeletons that are deep within the museum stores, or do something with them because they believe them to be their specific and a significant ancestor of theirs, is a problem as well.
I mean, we've gone through a long conversation, and I feel that there's so many other areas we could address, but I think we've encapsulated some of the key points of what this research that you've been participating in. And it's all a team effort. It's all, you know, we've made that point very clear, but I think it's really important to have captured all that. And people, despite us being in a soundbite economy and society, there is an appetite for this long form content that students and scholars and the general public want to hear from you. And I think I'm just really hope this is a useful way in, both hearing what you have to say, but also following up on some of the publications we'll put in the description. I wondered, Tom, if you had any final thoughts, any sort of Archaeodeath final thoughts moment for anyone about this topic. I mean, it's complicated is one takeaway for me, but I don't know if you have any others.
Yes, maybe a few points. I mean, thinking about the future of the field.
Yes.
What everyone's getting excited about is sedimentary DNA, and increasingly people are finding that you can get DNA from human DNA that's just in the sediment, that you don't need a skeleton anymore, that you could just have the soil, and you can there was a paper published actually last week where they essentially sampled the soil that was stuck to a skeleton to see whether they got the same genetic sequence from the soil as from the skeleton. So basically saying, does the grave soil also hold the genetic sequence of the skeleton that was in there? If say,
I'm behind on all this.
Like Sutton, who, well, I mean, this is bleeding edge stuff. I don't think I would necessarily anticipate it, but so that it would be. And they did find that, I mean, always the quality is never going to be as good from what you get from a bone, but they did manage to get at least a partial sequence of the individual. So it's basically proof of concept that potentially the soils hold at least some information on individuals to a certain degree. So what it means is that we don't have to potentially destructively sample bone, but also that even in graves where there's no skeleton, there's a chance that we might be able to still get some kind of information from them. So like in places like Sutton, where you have just body stains rather than remains, there's a possibility that you could get at least some kind of information from the body that was in there. I mean, there's still a lot to work
wow.
out in sedimentary DNA, how much the DNA moves between different sediments of different types, to what extent does the acidity or water movement affect the preservation of the DNA. But it's more of a possibility than it ever has been, and it's a tantalizing way forward for ancient DNA, is that you don't even need the bones, you just have skeletons or even an artifact. I don't know if you came across this Paleolithic pendant, which was a deer tooth pendant that had preserved the genetics of the person who had worn it. So presumably it was partly because of the substrate. So this deer tooth, because it was dentine, it was quite absorbent, so it absorbed the DNA of the person that was carrying it. But yeah, from this Paleolithic artifact, they managed to get out the genetic, some of the human DNA from the person that was wearing it. So yeah, I mean, there's still, like I said, I talk about these sort of frontiers always being pushed forward into places that we didn't expect them to go. I mean, this is another thing, is getting the human DNA from soil and artifacts that we could never anticipate before. Yeah, in terms of final thought, I guess the headline always from me is that genetic change, particularly when it's over hundreds of years, doesn't mean invasion and conquest and one population get wiped out by another. There are lots of different things that can differ between groups of migrants and groups of local people. Like infant mortality is probably the most important one, but also disease and subsistence and diet, which means over the long term, a genetic signature of a people can change quite significantly over the time. So actually assessing those claims of invasion and what's driving migration have to be resolved by looking at the archaeological evidence. What's the archaeological evidence for violence, for there being a big catastrophe? And if it's not there, then we have to explore different reasons. Or, I mean, like for something like the early medieval period, look at the different regional dynamics of change and how that falls with the archaeology, because it's not happening the same. Like, one of the big things to come out of the last paper that there was on early medieval Britain is that, yes, okay, the headline figure, there's a big influx of ancestry from across the North Sea. But then when you look at each site specific, something slightly different is happening at each site, and the way that this ancestry is flowing in and being integrated with the local people. So, you know, invasion and conquest narratives might apply in certain parts of the country, but it's different in other parts. Again, it's nice bookend, and we're back to the macro and the micro again.
Yeah, exactly.
Integration. We're never going to get the full story and be able to. We can't really start talking about things like invasion or other mechanisms of migration and change until we get these micro stories helping to resolve the macro stories and integrating them better with the archaeological evidence. And then that's when we can start really talking about what are the processes that are driving these changes in both the archaeology and in the genetics as well.
Wow, I just have to finish by thanking you for your passion, your enthusiasm, your expertise, and
thank you,
your
Howard.
insights.
It's a pleasure
it's
to
been
be
really great, and just good luck with all of your ongoing projects and endeavors, because it's such important work. We and you know, I think it's going to be changing by the hour, but you know, I hope this will serve as a useful stop point for reflecting on the research and the public consumption issues for people who are just new to this, maybe want to learn more. There'll be, as I keep repeating, there'll be links in the description. But just to say thank you so much, Tom.
No, thank you. Thanks, Howard.
Follow Archaeodeath on YouTube, TikTok, WordPress, and a host of other social media.